for our story today, we're talking about President Donald Trump suggests a takeover of the Gaza Strip. What would that look like military-wise?
Sure. Whenever you talk about President Trump and his policies, I always tell people, listen to President Trump with your eyes and not with your ears. What do I mean by that? People get very energized by some of the language that he uses. But you got to remember, he is a negotiator. He's a businessman. So he'll take an extreme position when in reality he just wants to get you here. And we've seen that happen in the last 2 weeks on many occasions. So the president has indicated, kind of off the top of his head or off the cuff, as we say, what if the United States takes over the Gaza Strip? I don't think that will ever happen. We have expended trillions, $1 trillion plus in Afghanistan and Iraq. We've been at war with radical Islamic extremism for many, many years. There's no appetite in the country for us to get involved on the ground with boots into the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip is governed up until recently by a terrorist organization by the name of Hamas. They are a radical Islamic extremist group that in their charter they say right up front, we want to destroy the nation of Israel. So this is an organization that cannot be allowed to take power again. The question is, how do you rebuild? Because the war is coming to a close, and that area needs to be rebuilt. You've got 1.7 million Palestinians in that area. What are you going to do with those people? How do these things work out? Historically, and you've got to understand the historical background before you can really make any sense of what the president said. Historically, Israel is a nation state. They were organized as a nation state, recognized as a nation state in 1948 by the United Nations. The Palestinians are not a state. They are a non-state actor. Israel has been attacked several times in their history, different wars, the 1967 war, the 1973 war, and each time Jordan and Egypt have been involved in those conflicts, and they've lost those conflicts. But when you regain a status of peace, the Jordanians basically said, we're going to cut loose the West Bank that used to be part of Jordan, and the Palestinians that live there, they're no longer our problem. The Egyptians did the same thing in the Sinai with Gaza. And after 1973, Israel sued for peace with the Egyptians. Peace treaty called for the Israelis to give back the Sinai Peninsula, but they didn't give back the Gaza Strip. So what you have is you have enclaves of non-state actors, lots of them, in those two regions. Something has to be done. One of the options on the table that I do not disagree with is that the Jordanians, who originally had that territory, and the Egyptians, who originally had the Gaza Strip, they've got to become involved in this peace process. They've got to step up to the plate, because on the other side of Gaza is the nation of Egypt. Yes, Israel's on one side, Egypt's on the other. They have a greater claim to the area than the Israelis do. In fact, the Israelis have no claim to it. They withdrew their forces from that area in hopes of peace. Bottom line, it's a very complex issue, but the Jordanians and the Egyptians have to become involved in the process. I think that's what the president is shooting at. He's not realistically calling for U.S. soldiers to go in and take over the Gaza Strip, but he takes a position that's away from what he really wants, and that is for the Egyptians and the Jordanians to get involved, just so he can pull them to the center of what he's trying to do. This is the way he negotiates.
Right, it's a way to negotiate because he thinks of this as a business, correct?
He does. He thinks of the United States as a business, in my opinion, and he's been a very successful businessman. And when you do a business, you're doing it to succeed, not to fail. So his mantra has been, make America great. That's his goal. And so this is not really an American problem. This is a Middle Eastern problem. Why would we get involved? Well, we have strategic interests, of course. Israel is our number one ally in the region. Israel's the only democracy in the region, quite frankly. So we have a long history of ties with Israel. And but on the other hand, no one wants to see people suffering. And so I think he's doing what he can, and he's setting out a negotiating position. But in my personal opinion, that's not his goal. The American people are weary of wars, and he is not a warmonger in my personal opinion.
That was my next question that you sort of just answered, is why would we get involved if it had nothing to do with us directly?
Yeah.
So if this does come into fruition, what would that look like? How would that impact us here in America?
Well, I think it's going to be a long process. This is not something that's going to be solved overnight. I don't know what the end state's going to look like, but it's got to involve Egypt and Jordan, because those two countries originally housed all the Palestinians in that area. And therefore, they have a responsibility. And in my opinion, they have not lived up to that responsibility for decades. They've kind of washed their hands of the whole thing, and the Palestinians have suffered as a result. So they've got to become involved. I think that's what the president is really getting at. Now, we can assess with money and other activities, but ultimately, if you're going to see a solution, those two countries have to become deeply involved.
Now, with your military experience, if this does come into fruition, what does that plan look like for someone that was in a position before?
Yeah, so, if the president was going to become involved in reconstruction activities, we might send in some teams to assist in rebuilding. And we've done that in the past. We call that nation building. I just don't think we're going to send any soldiers on the ground. But then if you send in individuals to assist in rebuilding, you've got to have security protections. We saw what happened under President Reagan in Beirut. We lost hundreds of Marines that were killed by a suicide bomber as they slept in their barracks. So we've got to be very cautious about getting involved and how far we want to get involved. But I don't rule out that we will be involved to provide assistance, much as the military is doing right now along the southern border. Our military is not protecting the border. Our border patrol is. We're providing assistance. I think that's more in mind of what something might happen, but I think that's secondary. I think his primary goal is to get the Egyptians and the Jordanians to become involved in the peace process.
Yeah. So you said this before that with his experience, we don't want to scare people. You don't think this is going to happen. It's not going to come into fruition.
No, I don't think anybody believes this is going to happen. The president has a penchant for hyperbolic language. Now, that's not my military language, but my military language would be something different. But he does say things, as I said, listen to the president with your eyes, not with your ears, because what is he doing? And that's really all that matters. And we have a record to measure from the 4 years when he was in office. He said a lot of things that people scratched their head, but what happened? Taxes were lowered, borders secure, America was prospering, inflation is around 1%. Listen with your eyes. These things happened.
Is there anything else that you'd like to get out to the public for them to know about this situation that he proposed?
I think most people understand President Trump by now. The majority of the American people voted for him. I don't think this is a newsflash that he says things that are out of the ordinary. And I think they understand that he's saying it's one thing, but he wants something else. I think people understand that. But obviously, the party out of power never says the party in power is doing a good job. So when Democrats are in power, Republicans don't say you're doing a good job. When Republicans are in power, Democrats don't say you're doing a good job. We understand that. So take everything with a grain of salt and consider the source.